The most decorated British field officer of the Second World War was denied his country's highest award by a hand that 80 years have never named. The recommendation carried 5 signatures. A brigadier wrote it. 3 generals endorsed it, and a field marshal commanding an army group approved it. Then someone in London drew a line through it. The paper survives. It lies in a gray folder at the National Archives in Kew, where the letters VC are written and then struck out, with no reason beneath the strike, no initial, no name. A king would ask why the award never came. The system that owed him an answer has spent 8 decades declining to give one. This is the search for the hand that held the pen. To understand what that line erased, the story returns to Egypt in the summer of 1941. Britain was losing the desert. General Erwin Rommel had thrown British forces back across Libya in weeks. Tobruk sat under siege, and Axis aircraft ranged over the convoys keeping Egypt alive. The Royal Air Force could not touch the enemy where he was weakest. German and Italian machines stood in rows on forward landing grounds along the coast, hundreds of miles behind the front, refueling, rearming, unbothered. Every fighter that rose from those strips cost ships, cargo, and men at sea. Long-range bombing achieved little against dispersed airfields, and the convoys fighting through to Malta paid for that failure in sunk tonnage and drowned crews. Seaborne commando raids against the coast had been tried, and had failed, at a price in ships and trained men the Mediterranean fleet could no longer pay. The problem was not courage, it was reach. A wounded subaltern in a Cairo hospital proposed a different arithmetic. David Stirling, a lieutenant recovering from a parachuting accident, argued that a handful of men inside an airfield at night could destroy more aircraft than a bomber wing could in a month. They would drop by parachute, walk to the target, lay charges on the machines by hand, and disappear into the desert. Middle East headquarters, short of victories and shorter of options, let him try. The unit was named L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a deliberate fiction built to convince enemy intelligence that a full parachute brigade stood in Egypt. Its confirmed strength was 5 officers and around 60 other ranks. Among the first officers Stirling took was a dangerous name. Legend says he recruited Robert Blair Mayne from a cell where the Irishman waited to answer for striking a superior. The legend is embroidered, and historians dispute the cell, but the man was real enough. Mayne stood 6 feet 3 inches, an international rugby forward who had toured with the British Lions in 1938. A solicitor by training, quiet in speech, and catastrophic in temper. Officers who served with him described a man who read poetry in his tent and dismantled bars with his fists. The army had very nearly finished with him. The desert was about to make him indispensable. The detachment trained itself at Kabrit beside the Suez Canal, and the training predicted the doctrine. Men jumped from moving trucks to rehearse landings, which meant broken bones before the first shot was fired. The bombs were purpose-built by Lieutenant Jock Lewes, a charge of plastic explosive and thermite weighing about 1 pound, which meant one raider could carry a dozen and account for a whole line of parked fighters. Incendiary and explosive in one package, it burned the wing and detonated the fuel inside. Nothing it touched flew again. The transport was 5 Bristol Bombays of 216 Squadron, pre-war machines cruising below 200 miles per hour, which meant a long, slow approach through whatever weather the coast produced. The first operation was tied to General Auchinleck's November offensive to relieve Tobruk, and the stakes ran both ways. Success in one night would prove the concept. Failure would hand headquarters every excuse to disband them. On the eve of the attack, the detachment would drop beside enemy fighter fields around Gazala and Tamimi and burn the German Air Force on the ground. Every line of the plan assumed men could land in darkness, find each other, and find their bombs. Nothing in it allowed for a storm. On November 16, 1941, the forecast turned. Wind over the drop zones was rising toward 30 knots, roughly twice what a night parachute descent was considered able to survive, and rain squalls were building along the coast. Multiple accounts describe what followed as the worst storm in that desert in 30 years. The drop could have been postponed. Stirling judged that cancellation would kill the unit at headquarters as surely as weather might kill it on the ground, and the 5 Bombays took off into the dark. The storm took them apart. Aircraft wandered blind through cloud and flak and dropped their sticks of men miles from the zones. Parachutists hit the ground at the speed of a moving car and were dragged across stone and camel thorn until they could collapse their canopies, if they could. The containers holding the bombs, the fuses, and most of the water scattered beyond finding. Lieutenant Ewan McGonigal, Mayne's closest friend since Ireland, came down far from the objective and died of his injuries. One Bombay was lost with its crew and every man aboard. Somewhere around 65 raiders had jumped. Over the following days, 21 or 22 walked or crawled to the desert rendezvous, where a long-range desert group patrol under Captain Jake Easonsmith waited with trucks and water. 5 were confirmed dead. 28 were prisoners. Not one charge had been laid on one enemy aircraft. The first operation of the Special Air Service had destroyed nothing except very nearly itself. Headquarters had every reason to fold the survivors back into the infantry and forget the experiment. What saved them was a change of method and one man's ruthlessness. The long-range desert group had driven out to collect the survivors, and the lesson drove home with them. If aircraft could not deliver raiders, trucks could. 3 weeks later, on December 14th, the patrols carried the detachment back into Libya by land. At Tamat Airfield that night, Mayne led a party through the perimeter on foot. Accounts left by men beside him describe him kicking open the door of the pilot's mess and firing into the lit room, a detail repeated across memoirs and denied by no participant, though the toll inside was never established. The party then worked down the line of parked machines planting charges, and when the bombs ran short, Mayne tore the instrument panel out of a cockpit with his bare hands. At least 14 aircraft burned at Tamat that night, and the most cited count says 24. 2 weeks later, Mayne went back to the same field and burned what had flown in to replace them. One officer had wrecked more enemy machines in 2 visits than many fighter squadrons claimed in a year. The detachment that had failed utterly in November was, by January, the most economical weapon in the theater. The record escalated from there. Mayne received the Distinguished Service Order in February 1942 for Tamat. When Stirling was captured in January 1943, command passed to Mayne, and a bar to the order followed the landings in Sicily that autumn. A second bar followed operations in France, by which point the National Army Museum credits his desert raids with over 100 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 4 awards of the same order would eventually stand against his name. Confirmed in the registers, only a handful of men in the entire war matched that record. By April 1945, he was lieutenant colonel, commanding the 1st SAS Regiment in Germany, 180 men in 40 armed jeeps, scouting ahead of the 4th Canadian Armored Division toward Oldenburg. Reconnaissance in open vehicles against a defended countryside meant finding ambushes by driving into them, and the operation would cost the regiment 5 dead, 19 wounded, and 11 missing or captured before Oldenburg fell. On April 9, though some operational histories record the following day, the lead section drove into one near the village of Lorup. A sniper killed the squadron commander, Major Dick Bond. Wounded men lay in a roadside ditch under machine gun fire, and 2 Panzerfaust rockets had already burst close enough to shower them with earth. In the lead jeep, shrapnel had pinned one of Major Schofield's legs to the bodywork, and a bullet had gone through the other. Mayne came forward within about 10 minutes, under standing orders that kept commanding officers out of the fighting line. Regimental accounts describe him taking a Bren gun into the nearest farmhouse with his driver, Billy Hull, a fellow Ulsterman, who drew the defenders' fire so Mayne could find and kill them. Then he called for a volunteer, and Lieutenant John Scott climbed onto the rear guns of his jeep. Mayne drove up the fire-swept road past the spot where Bond had died, turned, drove back, and came up a 3rd time, halting in the open while he lifted the wounded out of the ditch and onto the vehicle. In his signed witness statement, Scott described receiving cool, precise fire orders on a road where the squadron commander had been killed minutes before. Brigadier Mike Calvert wrote that Mayne, from the moment he arrived, dominated the scene. The ambush broke. The advance resumed. Calvert, commanding the SAS brigade, wrote the recommendation, and he wrote it for the Victoria Cross. There can only be one explanation why Colonel Mayne was not killed, his assessment read, and he found that explanation in sheer audacity. Major General Chris Vokes added that Mayne was worthy of the highest award for gallantry and leadership. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds signed. General Harry Crerar, commanding the 1st Canadian Army, signed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery signed for 21st Army Group. The form was dated July 20, 1945, and sent to London. On October 16, 1945, the letters V.C. on that form were struck through, and a third bar to the Distinguished Service Order was entered in their place. Confirmed by the government itself in a written parliamentary answer 80 years later, nothing on the form explains the change. No minute survives, no signature stands against the alteration. The most heavily endorsed recommendation of the campaign was overturned by nobody. Campaigners, among them the historian Damian Lewis, claim the reason hides inside one word. The original Victoria Cross warrant of 1856 asked for a signal act of valor, signal meaning outstanding. The claim is that a reviewer in London read signal as single, decided that because Scott fought beside Mayne, the act was not performed alone, and downgraded it on that basis. The warrant in force in 1945 is confirmed to demand no such thing. It asks for most conspicuous bravery. It says nothing about acting unaccompanied. Yet no document proves the misreading happened. A newspaper investigation in 2009, repeated by Lewis, named General Sir Henry Wimms of the War Office as the likely hand, and offered a motive in his hostility toward irregular soldiering. That attribution remains claimed, never confirmed. The Ministry of Defense holds the opposite position, that the change resulted from rigorous review by the chain of command rather than administrative error, a position difficult to square with a form that records no review at all. What is confirmed is who noticed. King George VI, decorating Mayne after the war, is recorded asking why the Victoria Cross had so strangely eluded him. Mayne is reported to have replied that he had served his king to his best, and that none could take that honor from him. David Stirling would later call the outcome a monstrous injustice. Sergeant Jim Almonds, who had soldiered with Mayne from Cabrit onward, put it more plainly. His face did not fit, but his actions did. Mayne died in December 1955, aged 40, when his car struck a lorry near his home in Newtonards. The state's refusal hardened into policy, a rule that gallantry awards would not be reconsidered more than 5 years after the event, and every appeal broke against it. In 2005, more than 100 members of Parliament backed motions demanding the case be reopened. The answer was no. In Newtonards, the historian Peter Forbes kept calling Mayne the bravest man never to have been awarded the Victoria Cross, and the town raised a statue that says what the honors list would not. Books made the argument. Television made it louder, and after a drama series revived the story in January 2025, 3 former defense secretaries publicly backed the award. On April 8, 2025, Jim Shannon brought the case to the floor of the House of Commons, and the Veterans Minister, Al Carnes, announced that the Honors and Awards Committee would review the evidence and settle the matter once and for all. That promise is now more than a year old. As of August 2026, no finding has been published, the minister who made it has moved to another post, and the Cabinet Office body that examines historic medal claims states in its own terms of reference that gallantry awards sit outside its remit. Which committee actually holds the case has, like the identity of the hand itself, no published answer. None of this makes the verdict simple. Mayne's record carries genuine stains, including violence against his own side, that no citation mentions. Standards for the Victoria Cross had tightened sharply by 1945, and some historians argue the downgrade was defensible on those grounds. The misread word is an inference, not a document, and reopening one case invites 1,000 more from every war and every grieving family. But the file at Kew does not argue, it shows. Anyone can order War Office Series 373 and hold the page where 5 commanders wrote yes and an unnamed hand wrote no. The award was meant to be the verdict on the man. 80 years on, the page has become the verdict on the system that judged him. The line is still there.